now it is my honor to introduce Dr. Sharon Martin. I don't think I've had the pleasure of introducing Sharon at CJS before. She's a co-founder of the Charleston Jung Society and practices as a Jungian Analyst here in Charleston. She also travels quite a lot as a faculty member of the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, and also she serves at the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts as a training analyst and also on their executive committee. So she gets around, and if you haven't met her at a CJS event before, that could be why, one of the reasons why. But make no mistake that thankfully we have her guidance and support at CJS events, but also from a distance, and that's been for the last 10 years. So we really are very grateful for that. And personally, my experience of her presentations and my conversations with her, without exception, have been an inspiration and provided wisdom and guidance on my path, my exploration of consciousness, and it's been a great gift to me. So help me welcome Sharon Martin.
Hi, everyone. It's really good to see all of you here tonight to hear about this important, I think, very valuable material. I want to begin by thanking the board here. They are just doing a stellar job, and I'm very grateful to all of them. And that would be Betsy, the president, Chris Cuniff, treasurer, Larry Monteith, audiovisual, Linda Scott, programs, Preston Sachs, and Jennifer Santero. So Deanna Deaver, of course. Yeah. I just think what we're doing here is very important, and these people have done a great job to make this offering to the community. They are all volunteer, and it is a working board, I know, because I've been on it, and they do everything. Everything that you see here, the food, the wine, the programs, everything is volunteer, and they all labor from their hearts to make this happen. So I just want to give them a round of applause. So also, before we start, I just want to say that as a person who likes rather dark or at least values dark, melancholy subjects. And I make my living listening to people talk about those subjects, and I talk about those subjects. I just want to say that you may or may not feel better when you leave here tonight. You may, but you may not. But I do feel confident that I can do probably at least one thing for you. Can you read that? It says, look, making you happy is out of the question, but I can give you a compelling narrative for your misery. So I think I can give you your money's worth where that's involved. So as you know, if you read the synopsis for this talk, Carl Jung believed that our greatest problem is the lack of a respectful relationship between the ego, which is the center of consciousness, and the unconscious mind. He goes so far as to state, there is no form of human tragedy that does not in some measure proceed from the conflict between the ego and the unconscious. In order to become a whole person, these two aspects of the psyche must come together into a harmonious relationship. He called this process individuation, which is a way of saying becoming who you really are. One of the most distinguishing characteristics of this viewpoint is that it gives great value to the neuroses. From this perspective, neuroses are messages from the soul and indicate an urge to reach a higher or more expansive level of consciousness. This brings symptoms or neuroses such as depression or anxiety or addictions or choose your ailment into a new light. In Dr. Jung's words, in many cases we have to say, thank heaven he could make up his mind to be neurotic. Neurosis is really an attempt at self-cure. It is an attempt of the self-regulating psychic system to restore the balance, in no way different from the function of dreams, which are very important, but only rather more forceful and drastic. He says further, I myself have known more than one person who owed his entire existence, usefulness, and reason for existence to a neurosis, which prevented all the worst follies of his life and forced him to a mode of living that developed his valuable potentialities. These might have been stifled had not the neurosis, with iron grip, held him to the place where he belonged. He based his ideas on the concept of opposites, of which consciousness and the unconscious are a pair. He proposed that everything in the psyche appears as a pair of opposites, with each defining the other. For example, unless we know what it is to be sad, we can't know what it is to be happy, right? They define each other. Whatever attitude exists in the conscious mind and whichever psychological function is dominant, the opposite is in the unconscious. Now, if they are too far apart, there is trouble, and this is also known as a neurosis. The unconscious content must be made conscious so as to produce a tension of opposites, without which no forward movement is possible. The conscious mind is on top, the shadow underneath, and just as high always longs for low and hot for cold, so all consciousness, perhaps without being aware of it, seeks its unconscious opposite, lacking which it is doomed to stagnation, congestion, and ossification. Life is born only of the spark of opposites. If the conscious attitude becomes one-sided, the psyche regulates or balances itself by moving toward its opposite. Jung called this compensation. In fact, if some aspect becomes extremely one-sided, it will inevitably turn into its opposite, creating what Jung called an enantiodromia, which is a really cool word from the Greek, which means simply a swing from one extreme to the other. As Dr. Jung said, there is no light without shadow and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. To round itself out, life calls not for perfection, but for completeness. And for this, the thorn in the flesh so to speak, is needed. The suffering of defects without which there is no progress and no ascent. For without the pain of the neurosis, we would simply languish in sleepy inertia. So in a simple example, I have a female patient who suffers from a neurosis typical of Southern women, and maybe throughout the world. Extreme niceness, or sometimes I call it toxic niceness, the opposite of which is brutality. This is, my slides are out of focus. Out of order. Sorry about that. So in this slide, we see the coming together of opposites. And when two opposites come together, the middle is where all the action is, right? So that's where the energy comes from. So we were talking about toxic niceness and its opposite, brutality. I think this is clearly portrayed in a pairing in a movie called Gone with the Wind. I hope you guys are old enough to... How many of you have not seen Gone with the Wind? Oh, great. Okay. Oh, one. Okay. Well, this may not make a lot of sense to you. But here we have Melanie. And I don't know if you guys remember how incredibly sweet she was in her role in Gone with the Wind, but she was beyond sweet and nice. And of course, you know who carried her opposite? Scarlett. And didn't we all like her a lot better? At least I did. So as my patient persists unconsciously in her very sweet compliance, like Melanie, who actually ends up dying, without a conscious connection to its opposite, neurotic symptoms arise, such as codependency, resentment, outbursts of anger, and even a heartless kind of brutality against herself and others. Or alternatively, she may connect with a man who may act it out for her. She is not one with herself. It is the unconscious opposite breaking through, sometimes seeping out gradually and sometimes exploding in a brutal fit of rage. Now, this is psychological physics. We could say that these breakthroughs have also created a thorn in the flesh for her, which demands her attention. The repressed dark emotion of my patient, which is undoubtedly related to trauma, is merely triggered because it's already there. It's just in the unconscious. It has relatively little to do with her outer circumstances and breaks through unconsciously, which means that it will be negative and destructive. Following these episodes, she always suffers intense guilt, which is part of a defense, I think, against her more acute and legitimate suffering. However, if she becomes aware that a certain amount of brutality is a legitimate response and can learn to accept its reality in her psyche, then she is moving toward wholeness. An enormously important pair of opposites in the psyche is the adult and the child. It is this pair that plays the starring role in our lives and in psychoanalysis because it determines truly the direction of our lives. From a trauma perspective, dissociation from the child is inevitable, since we all have some degree of trauma. When we experience trauma, and I reiterate, we all do, Defenses arise from the unconscious to rescue the child from the unbearable feelings which are impossible for her to integrate. The child and her feelings are put away. The name of this painting, this is a very old painting, I think 1500s, and this is Children in Limbo, or Purgatory. So it's put away in the unconscious until we have adequate resources to work through it. This happens with severe trauma, such as physical or sexual abuse, but it also happens when we feel unseen or unheard, or devalued, or rejected in some way, or abandoned by one or both of our parents. But the suffering remains meaningless until it becomes conscious. And the conscious attitude is one-sided, and it unconsciously moves toward its opposite. In this case, we may see an otherwise responsible adult throwing a childish temper tantrum. We see a lot of this in the news today, don't we? We must return and reconnect with the child, says Dr. Jung, and Joseph Campbell, and Sigmund Freud, and James Hillman, and also Jesus, among others. Eventually, usually around midlife, the inner world calls by way of a repetition of the original trauma in some form. And perhaps it takes a few repetitions or numerous repetitions. And it most often happens in a marriage or some kind of relationship. Then the opportunity for integration is presented by way of the midlife crisis, which is an attempt to heal the inner split from the child. Jung has called the child the archetype of wholeness. Some would call this the main, if not the sole purpose of psychoanalysis. For in this way, things repressed and forgotten come back again. Now, Dr. Jung was fascinated by alchemical texts of the Renaissance because he felt that anything with so much power and numinosity must have some profound psychological truth in it. He saw alchemy, which, if you don't know, is the transmutation of base elements into gold. This is alchemy. He saw this as a metaphor for the process of individuation and wrote several of his collected works on the subject. Though its language and its illustrations are often bizarre, it can be very helpful in understanding our neuroses. In alchemical language, the neurosis is known as the prima materia, the prime material. It is also referred to as Saturn, or lead, which is the basis substance in the universe. Although of great inward value, the prima materia is usually vile or unacceptable in outer appearance, and so is despised, rejected, and thrown away into the ditch or onto the dung heap. This is the beginning, however, of the alchemical process, or individuation, metaphorically, which is long and difficult. It is from these base and seemingly worthless elements, however, that the gold eventually emerges. Therefore, those aspects of ourselves which are most painful and most humiliating are the very ones to be brought forward and worked on, our neuroses. It turns out, to our great surprise, that the ditch is the place to look for the gold. We find the same motif in fairy tales. In the tale of Beauty and the Beast, we feel somehow a deep resonance with the story. For the beast, in all his repulsive ugliness, at the end, turns into the enchanted prince and marries the beautiful and intelligent Belle. This theme appears in countless other stories, such as The Loathsome Lady, which is probably my favorite fairy tale ever, in which the bewitched hag turns into a radiant beauty. Also, the ugly frog or monster who turns into a handsome prince when kissed by a princess. The dumpling whom everyone laughs at but becomes the hero. Or the stepdaughter who sits in the cinders and ends up queen of the kingdom. We feel an affinity with the characters in these stories because something in us understands that these difficult situations bring out the best in us. This feeling of familiarity and rightness is characteristic of the response which fairy tales evoke in us. This is because the fairy tale is symbolic of that which lives in the collective unconscious of all people everywhere, portraying an inner psychic reality, the bare bones, so to speak, of our inner subjective life. We could say that fairy tales are like dreams of the world. This explains the phenomenon of essentially the same stories from different cultures all over the world. Alchemy, mythology, and fairy tales all seem to have come up spontaneously from the unconscious. Their symbolism is the same. They are images which are a metaphorical map for psychological development or individuation. We also see this motif in the words of Jesus, who is at the center of our Western myth. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord hath done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. This is from Matthew 21:42. Likewise, we see the concept of opposites in the story of Job and in Dante's descent into hell. In some ways, it is the opposite of what's expected, but when transformation happens, it's kind of an aha. Like, of course, it's as it should be. Dr. Jung also believed that as I do, that anyone who attempts to deal with one's neuroses and the problem of opposites is making a significant contribution toward world peace. The man at peace with himself contributes an infinite amount to the universe. Attend to your personal and private conflicts, and you will be reducing by 1/1,000,000th the world conflict. And conversely, if one does not, that person contributes to world conflict. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That is to say, when an individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves. This is Dr. Jung. In view of all this, all the experiences we encounter in our lives, in some mysterious way, are attracted to us by the creative power of our own psyche. People are always creating the world and bringing about a reality that is reflected in the outer world. Although we do not truly understand this mystery, we can see clearly that it happens in every person's life. One only has to observe someone undergoing a process of self-reflection and development to see that the outer circumstances of our lives do actually follow the inner psychic changes. Our own inner life, the higher or the greater self, orchestrates all of the outer events of our lives. This is the archetypal energy behind the evolution of our consciousness. The unconscious creates impossible situations. For out of the impossible situation, which one? Which one? The unconscious creates a third thing of an irrational nature, which the conscious mind neither expects nor understands. Jung called this phenomenon the transcendent function, the union of opposites, or the conjunctio. That's an alchemical word. For just as in nature, when the opposites of male and female come together, something new comes, a new life. Whether it's the baby or the relationship, it's a third thing, born of the two, who is neither the one thing nor the other, but which mysteriously contains and transcends both. But if we make no effort to expand our consciousness so that we can understand the nature of our development and cooperate with it, then it will seem that we are simply a pawn of fate and we have no control over our lives. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The fact is, our freedom must be earned by learning about ourselves so we can understand the value of a particular experience in the context of the development of our whole self. Dr. Jung comments on this, saying, "For many are called, but few are chosen." Applies here as nowhere else, for the development of personality from its germinal state to full consciousness is at once a divine grace and a curse, and it certainly feels like that sometimes. Its first result is the conscious and unavoidable separation of the single being from the undifferentiated and conscious herd. This means isolation, and there is no more comforting word for it. Neither family nor society nor position can save her from it. The development of personality is a favor that must be paid for dearly. So we must learn about ourselves by looking inward. Otherwise, we will see what is happening to us as our own or someone else's fault or just very bad luck, so that even if we want to change, we are stuck. We're stuck in blaming. This need to blame is connected to a legitimate grief process which we are defended against, and is a place many of us can remain for a very long time, sometimes a lifetime. Merely wanting a problem to change and understanding the superficial reasons for its existence will not make the problem go away, because it may not truly be a problem. It may be an attempt on the part of the inner psyche to bring balance and a more inclusive viewpoint. The unconscious side of a human being always strives for wholeness and for integration, and will work through whatever channels the conscious person makes available. One typical way this happens is by way of a feeling of emptiness or purposelessness, even though one may have gotten everything one thought was wanted. It is only when one's conscious ideas of what is right or suitable come into direct conflict with the underlying path that one is unconsciously following, that real pain begins. There are many people sabotaging themselves. We all do it. Where regardless of what they believe they want in life, they continually do something to destroy the dream before it's realized. Often this destructiveness is connected with guilt and fear, behind which lies the legitimate acute suffering, which is for some a wiser and more meaningful path than the one consciously chosen. It is extremely valuable to understand that the nature of this conflict between the conscious and the unconscious, or dark and light, which we are calling the Neurosis, is neither good nor evil. This is really important. It is simply a necessity if we are to grow, because out of it can come eventual integration and greater consciousness. There is no fast and easy method of dealing with a neurosis. According to Dr. Jung, all the problems of life are ultimately insoluble. Isn't that great news? In the end, we don't resolve them, we outgrow them. So listen here to an excerpt from Dr. Jung's Visions seminars. I think he gave about 85 lectures on this woman's visions over a period of about 5 years. And I want to recognize her. Her name is Christiana Morgan. She had these visions, which she recorded and painted, and she went on to become a rather brilliant psychologist and taught at Harvard University. So here's her vision. I stood before a wall, and I said to the eye, "How shall I surmount the wall?" The eye turned inward on itself. I also turned my eye inward, and within myself I saw a growing tree. Dr. Jung says, again the eye turns and looks in upon itself, so she looks into herself and sees the growing tree, which is a symbol of development. The vision continues. Then I looked outward again at the wall, and I beheld a tree growing near it. I walked over to the tree. It gathered me up in its branches and lifted me over the wall. On the other side, I beheld an old man. So Jung asked the seminar, what does the symbolism mean? It shows how she overcomes the obstacle. The answer from a seminar member is, she overgrows it. Jung's answer, yes, quite literally. She grows over the obstacle. She assumes the position or the attitude of the tree. That is, she does not do it by will. She makes no violent attempt to force her way. She leaves it to natural growth. There is no other way. She has to stand still and wait until she has grown enough to reach over the top. That is a very definite psychological situation, he says. You see, the unconscious has a tendency to create an impossible problem. And as long as a patient has not been faced with such a problem, or as long as he can promise himself a solution of it, he has certainly not yet reached his particular problem, and all else is merely preparatory. For the unconscious always produces an impossible situation in order to force the individual to bring out his very best. Otherwise, one stops short of one's best. One is not complete. One does not realize oneself. It needs an impossible situation where one has to renounce one's own will and one's own wit and do nothing but wait and trust to the impersonal power of growth and development. The vision says to our patient, here is the wall, and you can only see the other side by turning the eye inward. You can only get over the wall by growing like a tree. Because the serious problems in life are never fully solved. If ever they should appear to be so, it is a sure sign that something has been lost. The meaning and purpose of a problem seems to lie not in its solution, but in our working at it incessantly. He warns, you can succeed in going away from your problems. You need only to look away from them long enough. You may escape, but it is the death of the soul. We must approach the neurosis with a religious attitude, which is simply an attitude that acknowledges and respects that which we cannot control. So this really goes against our Western mindset, I think. Our can do, our I will make things happen kind of perspective. And it's not that that doesn't have value. It does. It's only when things become too one-sided, and we have certainly become that. Our neuroses are educational in a practical as well as a psychological sense. The basic fact is, human beings do not earn free will except through self-discovery. And they do not attempt self-discovery until things become so painful that they have no other choice. In astrological language, this is recognized as the inevitable experience with Saturn, which my astrologer calls the long, hard, and dangerous, arduous road to wisdom. But Dr. Jung says tears, sorrow, and disappointment are bitter, but wisdom is the comforter in all psychic suffering. Indeed, bitterness and wisdom form a pair of alternatives. Where there is bitterness, wisdom is lacking, and where wisdom is, there can be no bitterness. The fact that there can be joy in this painful experience of our neuroses is not so easily recognized, but it does come at unexpected moments. And this is not a masochistic pleasure, but it is the joy associated with the exhilaration of psychological freedom. So, Saturn is an outer planet, right? And it takes, I think, 28 or 30 years to complete its orbit of the zodiac. So that gives you an idea of what you're dealing with when you're dealing with Saturn's energy. Everyone has at some time experienced the repeated frustrations, disappointments, and fears that go along with persistent neuroses. To ponder the question of what these experiences mean and how they can be used as opportunities goes exponentially beyond, I believe, the usually prescribed remedies of fortitude, self-control, and endurance. The dreary advice I was always given to have faith, hold on, be patient, wait on God, can be an equally useless attitude. What is infinitely more interesting is that perhaps what is being asked is that we turn inward and sincerely ask, why? Most of us, like Parzival in the story of the Holy Grail, have been conditioned not to ask this question. My mother, for one, had a little magnet on her refrigerator that said, never put a question mark where God puts a period. But man cannot stand a meaningless life, And so we must ask why. Because it is possible that through these experiences, we gradually learn to perceive the meaning of our own lives. So I want to talk now about depression. This is a neurotic symptom that's become a worldwide epidemic. But I'm wondering if this is a good place to take a break.